20 minutes before the tanker reached the enforcement line, it made its move. No radio communication, no request for clearance, no warning of any kind. The vessel, a medium-range tanker operating under a flag it had no right to fly, its tracking transponder feeding false location data to every monitoring station in the region, simply adjusted its heading, increased speed, and drove straight toward the corridor where the United States Navy was enforcing its blockade of Iranian ports. It moved as though the blockade did not exist, as though the warships on the horizon were decorative. On the bridge of an American warship, every screen lit up at once. What happened in the next few minutes sent a message that echoed from Washington to Beijing to Tehran, not because of what the tanker was carrying, not because of where it was going, but because of who had sent it. And because of what happened when the most concentrated naval force assembled in that strait in modern history responded instantly, decisively, without hesitation. The tanker turned around, and then it tried again, and again it was stopped. But here is what is not being said loudly enough about that moment. The tanker turning back was not the most important thing that happened. The most important thing was what it revealed about a confrontation that has been building for years beneath the surface of trade agreements, diplomatic statements, and carefully worded communiques from Beijing. For the first time in decades, the gap between what China says it can do and what China can actually do was exposed in public, in real time, on the world's most watched waterway. The implications of that exposure go far beyond a single tanker making a U-turn. What is unfolding in the Strait of Hormuz right now is not just a story about Iran. It is a story about the real limits of Chinese power. And the world is in the process of finding out exactly where those limits are. To understand why a tanker turning back carries the weight that it does, you first need to understand what had been built between Beijing and Tehran over the past decade and a half. The U.S. blockade did not just stop Iranian oil exports, it severed a strategic relationship that both countries had spent years constructing and that China had come to depend on in ways that went far beyond the price per barrel. China is Iran's largest trading partner and by far its most important energy customer. Iran supplied China with roughly 12% of its crude oil imports as recently as last year, barrels that were labeled as coming from other countries to obscure their origin, moving through a shadow fleet of tankers operating outside the sanctions framework that Western governments had spent years trying to enforce. The relationship ran deeper than commerce. Iran gave China access to Middle Eastern geography through Belt and Road infrastructure investments, most critically through the port of Chabahar in Iran's southeast, which offered Beijing a transit point that bypassed traditional American-influenced trade routes entirely. In exchange, China gave Iran something equally valuable: technology, infrastructure, diplomatic cover in international forums, and that shadow fleet of tankers that kept Iranian crude moving to Chinese refineries in defiance of Western sanctions. The two countries had built a system, a pipeline of oil, money, and mutual strategic protection that operated largely outside the frameworks Washington controlled. Iran needed Chinese demand to survive economically. China needed Iranian oil to stay cheap and its Middle Eastern foothold to stay relevant geopolitically. And then, on April 13, 2026, the United States Navy shut the entire system down in a single morning. Karg Island, the hub through which approximately 90% of Iran's crude oil exports flow, blockaded. Chabahar, China's carefully cultivated alternative gateway to the region, blockaded. Bandar Abbas, the entry and exit point for virtually everything moving in and out of Iran by sea, blockaded. Every channel through which Beijing had been purchasing discounted sanctioned Iranian oil was sealed simultaneously. The Belt and Road's Iranian leg became operationally useless overnight. Billions of dollars in Chinese infrastructure investment left stranded. The diplomatic shield Beijing had provided Tehran through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization was rendered irrelevant, because the problem was no longer being solved through diplomacy. It was being solved through 3 carrier strike groups, more than 24 warships, continuous air patrols, and submarine coverage that China had no way to contest in that geography. The strategic bridge built over years was cut in a single morning, but even that was not the moment that truly revealed the depth of China's problem. That moment came when Beijing decided to test whether the blockade was real. The tanker Rich Starry, owned by a Shanghai-based company already under American sanctions, approached the enforcement zone and made its move. It turned back. A second sanctioned vessel followed the same course, then a third. Multiple China-linked tankers executed U-turns before clearing the blockade line, without a shot fired, without a standoff, without a confrontation, just a turn and a message received. China's foreign ministry stepped forward and issued words that were designed to sound like power. The ministry condemned the blockade as, quote, a dangerous and irresponsible move. Beijing said the strait was vital to international navigation. It said China had trade and energy agreements with Iran. It said the United States should not interfere in China's legitimate commercial interests. Strong words, commanding words, words that were broadcast through every state media outlet in China and circulated through diplomatic channels worldwide. And yet, not a single ship was protected by those words. Not one tanker moved through the corridor that Beijing implied it had both the right and the will to defend. The gap between the statement and the reality was visible to every navy, every intelligence service, and every government watching this crisis unfold. And that gap is precisely where the most dangerous calculation of this entire confrontation now lives. China's problem is not simply the loss of Iranian oil. That, in isolation, is painful but manageable, at least in the short term. China holds substantial strategic petroleum reserves, estimated at roughly 120 days of net crude imports based on current storage data it can draw down. It can find alternative suppliers at higher prices. Russia has already been ramping up deliveries. The immediate disruption, while costly, is functionally absorbable. The real problem is the Strait of Hormuz itself, and the numbers explain why with absolute clarity. China imports roughly 11 to 12 million barrels of oil every single day, almost entirely by sea. Verified data from the U.S. Energy Information Administration and independent tracking firms places the share of that supply transiting the Strait of Hormuz at between 40 and 50%. Oil arriving not just from Iran, but from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Qatar. Add it together, and somewhere between 4 and 5 million barrels per day of China's most critical energy supply depends on that single waterway operating freely. As long as the U.S. Navy controls the strait, China's energy security is, in a very direct and immediate sense, at the mercy of American decisions. That is not an acceptable strategic reality for a country that has spent 2 decades projecting itself as a rising global power capable of operating independently of American-dominated systems. It is not acceptable for an economy whose industrial base, manufacturing capacity, and political stability all depend on affordable and reliable energy. And it is not acceptable for a communist party whose domestic legitimacy rests on delivering continuous economic growth to 1.4 billion people who have been told their country is becoming a superpower. This is why the Rich Starry's U-turn carries weight far beyond the cargo it was carrying. It was the moment China's claim to peer competitor status with the United States was tested in the real world on open water and came up short. So what does Beijing do now? This is where the crisis enters its most dangerous phase. Because China has options, and none of them are good. The first option is direct military confrontation. Can China send warships to Hormuz to break the blockade by force? In theory, yes. China has an overseas military base in Djibouti on the East African coast. The People's Liberation Army Navy has expanded dramatically over the past decade. Its port network through the Indian Ocean and toward the Persian Gulf provides infrastructure that could support naval operations. But the Strait of Hormuz is a completely different strategic environment from anything China has tested its military in. Against the force currently assembled there, 3 carrier strike groups anchored by the USS Abraham Lincoln, the USS Gerald R. Ford, and the incoming USS George H.W. Bush, more than 20 warships, F-35C and FA-18 fighters flying constant combat air patrols, P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft monitoring every inch of the surface, and submarines operating unseen below, the Chinese Navy faces a severe and unambiguous disadvantage. A Chinese warship forcing the blockade line means direct military confrontation between 2 nuclear-armed powers at sea. The last time the world came close to something like this was 1962, when Soviet cargo ships approached the American naval blockade line around Cuba. Military analysts watching this crisis are invoking that comparison deliberately. China is not in a position to risk that confrontation, not with Taiwan tensions already elevated, not with its economy absorbing serious damage from tariff escalation, not in a theater where American military superiority is overwhelming and visible to the entire world. The second option is what China has mastered in the South China Sea: gray zone tactics, Coast Guard vessels instead of warships, presence without the threshold of open conflict. Beijing could attempt to send commercial tankers with a quasi-official escort, establishing a shadow convoy that dares the U.S. Navy to respond. But this tactic works when you are facing the Philippine Coast Guard. It does not work when you are facing 3 carrier strike groups. If China sends a gray zone convoy and the U.S. stops it, Beijing's bluff is called in front of the entire world. The multipolar narrative that China has been constructing for a decade collapses in a single incident. The third option is the arena China knows best: diplomatic and economic pressure. Beijing holds a permanent United Nations Security Council veto. It can block any resolution that would legitimize the blockade. It can build international opposition. It can escalate the trade war, sell U.S. Treasury holdings, weaponize supply chains in the sectors where Chinese market dominance gives it genuine leverage. But none of these tools opens the strait. Diplomatic maneuvers operate on timelines measured in months and years. Chinese refineries are operating on timelines measured in days and weeks. A veto at the UN does not put oil in a tanker. The fourth option is what Beijing is actually doing right now: waiting, calculating, and attempting to make others absorb more pain than China itself absorbs. China has reportedly halted gasoline and diesel exports to squeeze regional competitors who depend on Chinese fuel. It has resumed purchasing American liquefied natural gas, reopening imports it had suspended during the trade war, attempting to create diplomatic leverage through selective economic engagement. Even as the military confrontation intensifies, Beijing is positioning itself as an indispensable energy supplier to Southeast Asian nations scrambling for alternatives, expanding regional influence even as its own energy situation deteriorates. China is hurting, but it is engineering conditions in which its rivals hurt more, and it has calculated, at least for now, that patience is considerably safer than escalation. The fifth option requires the most time and may prove the most consequential in the long run: building alternatives to Hormuz entirely. The China-Pakistan economic corridor running through Gwadar port on the Arabian Sea could theoretically move Gulf oil into China overland without passing through the strait at all. The crisis has proven beyond any doubt the strategic value of those investments, but those corridors cannot yet match Hormuz's capacity. They are a long-term solution to a short-term emergency. They do not help Chinese refineries that need oil today. Every option carries an enormous price. Beijing is calculating, but it is not taking decisive risks, and the gap between its words and its actions is the most important strategic revelation of this entire crisis. On the American side, the force assembled at Hormuz represents one of the most significant naval deployments in modern history, and it is growing. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group is already operating at full combat readiness in the Arabian Sea. The USS Gerald R. Ford, after recovering from an onboard fire in March that forced it briefly to European ports, has returned to the theater. The USS George H.W. Bush, having sailed around the entire African continent to avoid the contested Red Sea, is now approaching the operational area. When the Bush arrives, the United States will have 3 full carrier strike groups simultaneously deployed to a single theater, a concentration of force not seen in a generation. More than 20 warships, dozens of the most advanced aircraft flying daily sorties, submarine coverage operating below the surface. There is no comparable naval force anywhere near the Strait of Hormuz. There is no force China could deploy to the region that would match it, but American power at Hormuz is not without its own limits. Understanding those limits is essential to understanding how this crisis eventually resolves. Keeping 3 carrier strike groups deployed indefinitely to a single theater is logistically punishing. Aircraft carriers require constant maintenance cycles. Personnel rotation schedules constrain sustained operations. Ammunition resupply and fuel logistics for a force of this size are substantial ongoing operations in themselves, and every asset concentrated here is an asset that cannot simultaneously be present in the Taiwan Strait, the South China Sea, or the Baltic, where other potential flashpoints are watching this confrontation with intense interest. Allied support for the blockade has also been far more limited than Washington may have projected. The United Kingdom's Prime Minister stated explicitly that Britain is not supporting the blockade, focusing instead on diplomatic efforts to reopen the strait. Germany, Australia, and other U.S. partners also declined to participate. France is pursuing an independent diplomatic initiative with the UK, a multinational mission aimed at freedom of navigation, explicitly described as separate from the American enforcement operation. The United States is running one of the most consequential naval operations of the 21st century with a narrow coalition of declared supporters, and the blockade itself, while operationally effective in its first days, is not airtight. Shipping tracking data has shown sanctioned and Iran-linked vessels attempting the corridor, spoofing their transponders, hugging Iranian territorial waters, and in some cases successfully slipping through enforcement gaps. The Rich Starry turned back on its first confirmed approach, but subsequent tracking data suggests it later completed a transit. The blockade is real, the blockade is working, but the blockade is not absolute, and that gap between official enforcement and operational reality is where probing continues every day. Iran's position in all of this has undergone a transformation that would have seemed impossible just weeks ago. For decades, Iranian military doctrine rested on a single strategic pillar. The ability to close the Strait of Hormuz made Iran untouchable. The threat of that closure deterred military action. The actual closure gave Tehran leverage over every economy on the planet that depends on Gulf energy. Hormuz was Iran's weapon, its deterrent, its insurance policy against the overwhelming conventional military power arrayed against it. The United States and Israel launched their strike campaign on February 28, 2026, targeting military infrastructure, leadership networks, and the command structures that sustained Iran's military capability. Iran's response was to close the strait, the move it had always held in reserve. Oil prices surged above $100 a barrel. Fuel crises cascaded across Europe and Asia. Global shipping was paralyzed. Iran proved that its ultimate deterrent was real. And then America answered, not by restoring the status quo, not simply by reopening the strait and returning to the previous order. America answered by taking the strait away from Iran entirely, clearing the mines systematically, establishing a safe navigation corridor, opening it to world trade, and simultaneously locking every Iranian port behind a blockade that stops Iran's oil from leaving while letting all other commerce flow freely. The strait is open for everyone except Iran. Tehran wanted to punish the world by closing Hormuz. The American answer was to open it, but to lock Iran inside. Iran's own weapon was turned against it, its own strategic logic reversed and deployed against the country that had invented the tactic. What options remain for Tehran? Theoretically, several. In practice, almost none that improve its position. Laying new mines requires small boats operating in waters under constant surveillance and air patrol. A conventional naval breakout is not viable given the degradation of its naval forces. Striking Gulf state energy infrastructure would push Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates permanently into full alignment against Tehran and deepen regional isolation to a degree the regime cannot survive economically. Activating proxy forces through Lebanon and Yemen simultaneously would expand the conflict in ways that provide justification for military responses far exceeding anything already executed. Every option makes Iran's position worse. Every day the blockade holds, the economic pressure compounds. The revenue loss is now estimated at $400 million per day. The domestic economic crisis, which had already brought Iranians into the streets in numbers that threatened regime stability, is set to become catastrophically worse. And so we arrive at the question that every government, every military, every trading floor, and every energy market in the world is asking simultaneously, how does this end? Three possible futures are now in play. The one that materializes will be determined by decisions being made right now in Beijing, Tehran, and Washington. Future one is diplomacy. Iran returns to the negotiating table, the talks that broke down in Islamabad after a full day of negotiation led by American representatives, and presents a counterproposal that addresses the core demands on nuclear activity. China's quiet pressure on Tehran, pressure that Beijing cannot publicly acknowledge, but that is intensifying daily as its own energy security deteriorates, tips the Iranian calculation toward a deal. The blockade is lifted, a framework is signed, the strait returns to normal operation under international monitoring. This is the future Washington has engineered maximum pressure to produce. The entire architecture of the blockade, the escalating cost, the stranded oil, the revenue clock counting down, is designed to make this the only rational choice. Future 2 is escalation. Tehran activates the full network of its affiliated forces. The Bab el-Mandeb, the second most strategically vital waterway on Earth, faces disruption simultaneously. A confrontation in the strait involving Chinese-linked vessels and American warships produces an incident that neither Beijing nor Washington fully controls. The ceasefire collapses. Military operations resume under conditions even more severe than before. Oil prices breach levels that trigger a genuine global recession. The conflict expands beyond every boundary any party originally intended. Nobody wants this future, but it becomes more likely with every day that the diplomatic window narrows and the pressure on every party intensifies without resolution. Future 3 is a prolonged standoff. The blockade holds but does not force Iran to the table quickly enough. Questions arise about American logistical sustainability over months rather than days. Allied support continues to fail to materialize. Chinese shadow tankers continue probing the enforcement line, some getting through, maintaining a trickle of Iranian oil that slightly extends Tehran's runway. The crisis grinds forward without resolution, inflicting escalating economic pain on every party, restructuring global energy markets around alternatives that take years to build, and leaving a region permanently altered by a confrontation nobody found a clean exit from. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 lasted 13 days. It ended because one side blinked, because someone in Moscow looked at the American naval blockade line, looked at the military reality of what lay beyond it, and made the calculation that the cost of pushing through exceeded whatever could possibly be gained. In 2026, The same fundamental equation is playing out in a different strait, with different actors, different weapons, and decades of additional accumulated rivalry, but the core logic is identical. Military power is drawing a line. Diplomatic channels are the only path to a resolution that does not end catastrophically for everyone involved. China's tankers turned back. China's government issued statements of protest that could not protect a single ship. Beijing is calculating with great care but is not taking decisive military risks. And that choice, that deliberate decision to hold back from the line, may be the single most important variable in whether this crisis finds an exit or becomes something the world cannot contain. The distance between words and actions defines the real balance of power in the 21st century, and in the Strait of Hormuz, that distance is being measured in real time, one tanker at a time, one enforcement decision at a time, one day at a time, as the economic clock counts down toward a moment that changes the calculus for every party involved. Hormuz is no longer Iran's weapon. Hormuz is now Iran's cage, and the world is watching, waiting to find out who blinks first.